Tough act to follow. Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm getting so many texts from people in the room. Are you at Trade Desk? Are you at Trade Desk? So it feels like the whole industry is here. I'm so excited to be interviewing Jeff today. We are talking about a whole slew of things, but before we get started, Jeff, I wanted to just circle back on some of the news of the day from NBC and what Joe just announced. Obviously, Trade Desk has been pushing forward on the UID. It's been a leader in making sure that publishers and advertisers come together to figure out an identity solution. But there are people out there who say UID is just a Band-Aid. Why do we need to even come up with a unique identifier if we can create cohorts or something like that? What is your response to that pushback?
Well, first, let me just caveat that UID2 is not a Trade Desk initiative any longer. It was years ago. We open sourced it years ago. This is something that is much bigger than Trade Desk. It's much bigger than NBC, although I'm so delighted about their announcement, and they are a massive player. It's bigger than Disney or Paramount or any of the others that have adopted it. It is a part of the open internet. As I was explaining to one of the CEOs of currently a walled garden that I think we'll see open up at some point in the not too distant future, this is a currency for the open internet that makes it possible for the consumer to take their privacy settings, their preferences with them so that they're not beholden to a device or to a walled garden. And without a currency like that, where you can pin those preferences and the currency of identity, we don't have anything to talk about today. Every single person that came up here talked about identity. We don't have a way of managing universal reach and frequency, which almost every single panel talked about. So anyone who says that this currency is superfluous or unnecessary or a Band-Aid doesn't understand the mechanics of this industry.
So one of the groups that you might imagine may not have the same viewpoint as you is Google. And this morning you penned an op-ed about Google. And I want to read some of the lines in there because they were pretty pointed. You said that basically in bringing together all of its ad tech under one umbrella, Google created an incentive to exploit power for both engineers and salespeople. For advertisers and publishers, it seemed that accountability was distributed and incentives were aggregated. And somewhere along the way, a company that once prided itself on doing no evil was seemingly operating with a different mantra: win at all costs. I'd love to get your take on what's happening right now with Google. Obviously, they're a major competitor of yours. They're being sued by the DOJ. What do you think is going to be the outcome of that, and how does that impact Trade Desk?
I think there's nothing but upside for the Trade Desk and for the open internet. Because I believe we've been winning in an unfair marketplace. We've been one of the few that have managed to win in an unfair marketplace. And I believe there's not really any outcome that doesn't make it a little bit more fair. So it's either a little bit more fair or a lot more fair. I'm happy with either outcome.
Do you think you and Trade Desk would take a position to be more of a vocal leader on this issue, representing some of the other folks that you think have also been disparaged?
Yeah. I mean, I think we have been doing that. I mean, part of the reason why I've penned the last two op-eds, including the one that I wrote this week, is because we've been relatively quiet as it relates to specifics around antitrust and being as bold as the things that you just quoted. And we've decided that this is a moment where we just need to speak up. We think it's important for the open internet, and we think it's important especially when governments around the world are scrutinizing. And honestly, and this is maybe previewing a future op-ed, one of the things that Google has done really well is created a moat of complexity. They've made it really hard to understand what the hell they're doing. They rename things every 2 years. Every 2 years, some calendar reminder comes up and says, oh, it's time to rename DFP into the AdX, into GAM. We just constantly rename it. And hiding behind that complexity makes it very difficult for governments around the world to understand exactly what's left and exactly all the advantages that are there. And the only way that you can make sense of it is if you live it every single day. And there are so many companies that have been hurt. If you look at the LumaScape, compare the one from 15 years ago to today. see all the logos that have been kicked off of it. Ask any of those logos that are now gone, what impact Google had on their not being present any longer. Nearly every one of them will have a story to tell about that.
Why do you think it's taken so long then for there to be such an industry response to Google?
Because it's hard to coordinate. We've been in a nascent space, and one of the flaws of our industry, there's a number of flaws. One, we ruin words. Things like transparency, we turn into buzzwords. We also have this affinity towards acronyms where we just constantly are turning things into 3-letter acronyms to obfuscate. We create some of the complexity. But also, we've been unnecessarily competitive with each other. Everybody's been worried about getting their slice of the pie. And very few have focused on the fact that there is $1 trillion TAM. We've spent a lot of time today talking about how there are win-wins. It is way less exciting for us to come on stage and say, you're gonna win, I'm gonna win, we're all gonna win, let's go home. There's less controversy, there's less conflict in that, but there is the possibility of win-wins where every company who's been on stage today can win. I think it's taken our industry a very long time to understand that there are win-wins available, and people were worried about competing with each other. And sometimes with the unsaid acknowledgement that Google cannot be beat. And as a result, we're all fighting over the scraps. And so many people have been worried about, well, I just don't want to lose the scraps. But as people are becoming bigger and bigger, and as CTV is changing things, largely because of the strength of the media companies that have been on this stage today, I think you're starting to finally see some coordination and some courage to speak up that just wasn't present 5 years ago.
How does CTV help to encourage folks to speak up? Is it because sort of traditional publishers and other ad tech firms have a leg up over Google in CTV? What is it that's inspiring them right now?
There's a whole bunch of things. One, CTV is perfectly fragmented. No one has the ability to be draconian. One way to define walled gardens is that you're big enough to be draconian. If you have 75% plus market share in search, you can afford to be draconian. If you have 75% plus market share of social, you can afford to be draconian. Netflix, I remember a few years ago, boasted of having 11% of TV screen time. No one in TV has enough market share to be draconian, so everybody has to be cooperative. But the other, somewhat of an elephant in the room and a little bit inside baseball, is that there is no DFP. And for those of you that haven't been around long enough to live through the renaming of DFP, that's GAM, or Google's massive ad network that is built around their ad server. Because their ad server doesn't really enjoy a dominant position in CTV. Really, it's CTV and audio, and pretty much everywhere else they have a relatively dominant position. The fact that they don't have that dominant position in CTV leaves a way in. That when you have perfectly fragmented and then they don't control ad serving and measurement, that creates a possibility to open the walls up. And as I said almost 10 years ago, eventually the walls will come down, and that will be accelerated by connected television. It is our way in. It's our way to disrupt. And honestly, I don't think the open internet would have the chance that it does right now without CTV and those two dynamics working in our favor.
The connected television question, though, is interesting because obviously the folks who are trying to take a leadership position in connected TV, the folks on stage, they come from entertainment companies that have linear businesses. So they can't dive in completely headfirst. They need to have a measured sort of approach. When do you think we get to a point where those companies are 100% CTV and there is actually real significant pressure on Google?
Honestly, I don't worry about that issue. And the reason I don't worry is because the consumer is driving. And we've highlighted this a couple times today. The consumer is the one that is moving to on-demand because it's better. It's better to watch it when I want to watch it. And because that is the way the majority of content will be consumed. And because of just all the benefits of streaming, the consumer is moving in that direction. I am way more worried about it moving too fast than I am moving too slow. And I'm a tech company that moves really fast. If I were a media company that's much bigger, I would worry about that even more. So I think I can speak on behalf of the industry by saying we are way more worried about it moving too fast than moving too slow.
And what's the risk of moving too fast?
We don't have all the people to explain it all, to capture all the dollars, that you don't get rewarded for being more efficient and better simply because of the fact that you can't keep up with all the inquiry and all the potential. So the best doesn't always win in that environment just because water spilling over onto the floor, if you will.
Totally.
Yeah.
While we're in this middle ground, there's sort of an awkward stage where we're trying to figure out how we buy media. So we still have upfronts. I think a lot of companies are revisiting the way that they're doing upfronts and the way that they're selling media. Buyers are thinking differently about the way that they're buying media. Trade Desk's philosophy is upfronts should be no more, and that it should be a 365, 24/7 day of the year thing. How do you introduce that when the vast majority of TV dollars are still transacted in this sort of annual harvest timeline?
Yeah, so let me first say that, just correct a little bit of the premise of the question. I'm not arguing that upfront should be no more. It will eventually go away. And that will happen faster than any of us can handle. So in a way, we don't have to declare war on the upfront. The consumer's moving us to digital no matter what. In digital, we have a unique opportunity and a different set of problems. We have to basically turn, call it $10 CPMs into $40 CPMs. And sometimes that's 15 into 50 or whatever, but 10 into 40. And the only way that you do that is by making them way more relevant and way more effective. The problem with upfronts in digital is, as we've highlighted a few times today, it was created in 1962, and there is this sense of harvest where, like in commodities markets, where the corn's available at harvest, and then we have a farmer's market and we sell it all at the end of the season. Doing something once a year doesn't make sense. So there should be a forward market that is always on, and that forward market that is always on will look a bit more like a commodities market than it does the Don Draper era of upfronts in 1962. By doing that, you can bring data to bear, and only when you do that can you get the 40, 50 plus dollar CPMs where you get the best of both worlds.
Can we go back to this concept of the forward market? Is the forward market a type of market itself where you're doing transactions? Is it a technology? Is it a philosophy? What is it?
So it's all of those things. So at the risk of being too rudimentary on this, spot market, by definition in financial markets, means that you're selling in real time. Sometimes people mistakenly call an upfront a futures market, which is typically more a derivatives market where you're selling things like options.
Oh my God, we should be on CNBC.
Yeah. But a forward market is when you actually do take delivery of that, and those two things can operate on top of each other. So for instance, if you were buying stock like, Microsoft, typically the futures or the options are informed by what happens in the spot market. The spot market's what happens real time every day that the market's open, and the forward market are those where you're creating commitments to buy in advance. So they operate in commodities markets on a instrument called a forward contract, and those forward contracts make it possible to buy large chunks in advance, not dissimilar from the upfronts. And so we're borrowing from those concepts to make certain that we partner with people to bring all the very best things that essentially more sophisticated financial markets have, and marry those with data-driven digital advertising, so that we're not just doing the sort of spray and pray and the sort of at the harvest type of deals that were done in the upfronts decades ago.
Spray and pray, that's so good. In terms of the technology that's going to support this forward market idea, what does that look like?
Yeah, so it's worth taking a minute to just talk about the mechanics of it. So in the spot market, and spot market is another way of saying real-time programmatic, RTB, all of these terms that we've been replacing every couple of years, again, in the interest of keeping it confusing. RTB runs in real time. There is an auction that runs in real time. What can happen is if an advertiser strikes a deal with a content owner. So let's say that L'Oreal did with Disney. They strike a deal in advance. You essentially commit to spending, let's say, $10 million. Then you're effectively taking a trump card to the auction, where you can lay down the trump card and say, irrespective of what other buyers buy, or bid, rather, what other buyers bid, I play the trump card on behalf of L'Oreal to say this impression belongs to them, irrespective of the other bidders. And then they would be honoring that forward contract where they agreed to spend $10 million at specific rates in exchange for large commitments. That makes it possible to do what the upfronts have been doing for years, which is bring large amounts of dollars and commitments so that publishers and content owners have an understanding of what demand will be there so that they have guaranteed spend. And then it gets the very best of digital, where the advertiser and their technology can have the power of choice or decisioning. And only when you do that can you bring data to the equation. And only when you bring data to the equation can you turn $15 CPMs into $50 CPMs, which is back to the win-win.
Okay, but backing up for a second. In a traditional upfront with linear TV, the forecasting makes it easy to do something like this. There's 24 hours in a day, there's X amount of shows, there's 4 minutes an hour of commercial time, et cetera. And if you don't hit the audience, you true up later. In this model, you would need to have forecasted your digital inventory so far in advance, and you'd need to do it with a kind of level of precision that I don't think the market has, unless I'm misreading that.
No, you're right. You're getting to the hardest parts of forward market, which are really about segmentation and forecasting. So one advantage of having this harvest where you get all the demand at once is that you get it all at once, and then you can assess, oh, do we have all this inventory? Now, keep in mind, we were often wrong, right? You were betting on what shows were going to be hits. Some of them weren't. And so there were all these make goods, and there was a very high degree of trust. And that's largely because the forecasting wasn't that good before. So keep in mind, we're not competing with the best forecasting in the world. We're competing with forecasting that is pretty basic and been around for a long time. But what content owners we expect will do is segment their inventory into blocks. And that's the mechanism that they're labeled. You want your blocks to be small enough that you can forecast and that you can create niche audiences, but big enough that the forecasting job isn't off by orders of magnitude. So you're trying to right size those blocks. And then both sides, both the buy side and the sell side, are working hard on that forecasting so that we can make certain that we enter into commitments that are deliverable. There are the opportunities, and I think we're a couple of years away from really having this, but there is the opportunity to have what they call true-ups in commodities markets, where when you're wrong, you can actually run in real time, okay, what's the cost of me not delivering on this trump card, because essentially a true-up or a penalty will be assessed, and you can make the decision as a content owner, oh, I got a bid for $100 CPM, I'm not gonna honor that trump card. That is the way commodities markets work, and you just have to quantify the cost of not doing that. And then you can run things in real time, millions of times a second, with high degrees of efficiency. But that forecasting and segmenting is the only way that we're gonna get to $50+ CPMs in a forward market or an upfront market, which is absolutely what has to evolve in order for us to move along the high double-digit percentage of impressions that are currently sold on a commitment basis. Now, one thing you said is that, don't we have to know far, far in advance? Well, one benefit to it always being on is you can make commitments in 1 month increments, which is what I predict will happen for the foreseeable future, rather than doing it for entire seasons or for years. You don't have to do that anymore because it's always on. So you can do it by quarter, but I think quarterly and monthly are what you're going to typically see.
Those blocks that the publisher side is going to have to build out, what do they look like? Are they audience blocks? Are they blocks by show? Are they blocks, by certain segments that you can customize? And do each publisher do they all create their own types of blocks, or do we have a uniform standard?
So they can create their own, and I predict that it will be partly against the audience and partly against show. Just keep in mind, Where the most amount of value is in audience. We've always used show as a proxy for audience. So we used to say, well, it's football, and therefore let's show beer ads. But now we can target beer drinkers without having to know the show necessarily. I think you're going to see a number of content owners obfuscate the show, but give a bunch of other metadata in the interest of protecting their consumers, which is fine by the marketers. As long as they can bring their own data to the equation, they're fine with that scenario. So I think you'll see some differences across content owners, but you're going to see them segment with as much specificity as they can while not getting so small that forecasting becomes very difficult.
And on the forecasting side, who is responsible for helping each publisher get there? Is it the publisher themselves? Is the industry going to come together and kind of think about forecasting best practices? How's that going to work?
I think you're going to see more proprietary forecasting. Everybody has to build their own, especially in CTV. You're going to see some of the ad servers and SSPs do some of the work as they aggregate for more. But one of the things that I think is somewhat obvious to predict is that given that, especially in the US, nearly every CTV content owner has purchased an SSP in the last 10 years, all of them have their own capabilities to do yield management. And as a result, you're going to see them investing in forecasting and yield management tools. So you're going to see them do the forecasting on their own.
Going back to something you said earlier about marketers wanting to bring their own data in, how does something, we were just talking about clean rooms in the panel before this, how do you integrate your own sort of first-party data and clean rooms in with this new system of forward market?
So I actually think this is really essential. So, Lisa just described this so well when she was talking about 80% match rates. This opportunity for a forward market would not be possible if we didn't have a common currency, which maybe goes back to your very first question about the need for UID2 or a common currency around identity. And so the common currency is step one. A clean room so that you can activate your data, which is partly what makes it possible to do the segmentation on the inventory side and the data deployment on the advertiser side, really data deployment on both sides. So clean rooms become really essential to putting data to work, and clean rooms are effectively designed to do so in a consumer privacy-centric way. So that becomes very important, of course, as advertisers want to put more and more of their data to work in order to justify the premium that is likely to come with only 4 minutes of ads per hour, as well as a light ad load that has to be highly relevant. You have to have 80% match rates in order for that math to work.
And in terms of why Trade Desk is doing this now, like what does this mean for your business? How much are you investing in it? Is forward market where you expect most of the momentum in buying to be for your company in the next few years? Like what's the business imperative here?
Well, so all sophisticated markets have a spot and a forward market attached to them. The forward market hasn't really been as big of a deal as it could be in programmatic. We've leaned too much on PG, where especially the buy side gets rid of decisioning, and by doing that, they have to charge or they have to pay much less. So it's kind of a lose-lose to be too dependent on programmatic guaranteed, where you have very little decisioning, very little control over reach and frequency, all the themes that you've heard over and over again. So this is not just a business imperative for the Trade Desk. This is very important for the open internet and for all of CTV to level up the forward part of what we're all doing, which is to basically take programmatic guaranteed and limited decisioned PMPs. I've tried to throw in as many buzzwords as possible. We'll try to cover crypto and a few other things before then, but so that we can then focus on a forward contract that enables higher CPMs, more relevance, better efficacy, all those things we've been talking about all day.
Speaking about the buzzwords, when you're communicating to investors all of these new types of efforts that you're spearheading, do you think they actually understand what's going on at Trade Desk?
Yeah. Great question. I think they understand a substantial amount of it. It's very hard to know everything about what's going on in programmatic if you don't live it every single day, because it's evolving so fast, and for all the reasons we've been talking about, we ruin words, we obfuscate, we use as many acronyms as possible. But one thing that I love about interacting with Wall Street, and maybe it's partly just because of my own paradigm, I've essentially been trying to take the sophistication and all the learnings that I had from working in equities and bringing them into advertising. So the forward market is not a foreign concept to them. They live it all the time, because real-time trading has been in equities for decades. So when we talk about real-time, they're like, oh yeah, you just mean trading. And incidentally, things like RTB and whatnot will be things of the past, not the concepts and the technology, but nobody says real-time stock trading, even though all stock trading is real-time. The same thing will happen with media. So as Tim opened today, everything's eventually going to be transacted digitally, even if it's not digital. And everything that is transacted digitally will be transacted programmatically. If we do it on a forward basis because one of the advisors is entering the order, that's fine, but it'll compete alongside spot market and forward market contracts, so they all compete together, not dissimilar from the stock market. So financial investors understand that this is all heading in a place where you create price discovery, rules, regulation, an auction with integrity that happens inside of the equities markets every day. Not to say that that auction is perfect. It's not, but it's certainly a lot better than the one described in the complaint by the Department of Justice.
As we move more into this forward market, what is the role of direct sales going to transform into?
They will continue to sell, because one thing that has definitely happened in all markets too, including in some of the things I've talked about today, is that as markets mature, they become more complex. That's just a rule. Let's just accept the fact that markets are going to continue to get more complex. With that, the need for advisors goes up, not down. With that, the complexity of entering orders is much more difficult. It will be harder to enter a forward contract than it was an upfront deal. It will be better, but it will be harder. So the need for experts, advisors, salespeople, and I love how it was framed earlier that it's less about salespeople and more about advisors. I do believe that's going to happen. It's not dissimilar from financial markets as they too continue to get more and more complex.
While we're talking about complexity, I think the big question in the media and tech industries right now is to what extent do we integrate generative AI into our workflows versus let it eat our workflows? What role will AI play in forward market?
Well, first of all, thank God we said AI, because we almost missed a buzzword. So for those of you playing buzzword bingo, I should have heard bingo at this point. But I think the very best place for AI in advertising in the short term will be on the creative side. And we've heard on this stage 3 or 4 times today how thousands of new advertisers are going to be coming to CTV in the next year. I believe that as well. To take thousands into tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands, I think using AI to make it so that you can basically take footage from your iPhone 14, or at that point 15 or 16, and take AI and put together a 30-second spot that is really compelling. If we can do that for tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of advertisers, everyone in this room benefits from that. I think there's a whole bunch of work that can be done in copy, in creative generation, in creative variety, especially as you hear us talk about reach and frequency. We would love to have more variety. That will increase efficacy. And there's a role for AI to play in helping all of that.
Do you have any concerns? We just talked about the Google DOJ suit, about regulatory issues around AI.
I think it's really interesting to see what will happen in terms of content, and especially reserving content so that AI doesn't sort of take that and then then the user doesn't end up on the destination that created the information. But because I'm just such a believer in content is king, curation is important, and I just believe that editorial curation is here to stay for so long. Storytelling is so critical that on all the issues that we're talking about, I don't think AI is positioned well to disrupt those things. There's a lot of other disruption that will come first. And I don't know that it will ever get to that, to be honest.
I want to take a 30,000-foot view of the entire ad tech landscape right now. We had an unprecedented number of companies go public via SPACs in 2021. I think the slowdown in the ad market has made it tougher for a lot of your peers and competitors. Everyone is feeling the brunt of that. What do you think happens next from here? Do those companies get taken back private? Do they wait out the storm and stay public? What's your thoughts?
Well, so I am most interested in having a competitive landscape. I mean, one thing that is good about an environment that is under pressure is that it gets rid of waste in the supply chain. It makes it so everybody is looking to do more with less. We've heard that theme over and over again today as well. And that makes it so that the supply chain does become more effective. That's much, much harder to do when times are good. So there are some benefits that come from that. What is much harder is if you're a company that was struggling to make it or struggling to become profitable, and then times get tough and you're under some pressure, it can be harder for those to compete. So I am worried about some of the smaller companies that sort of barely got public, that were hoping to ramp up and hoping to grow into hefty valuations, that it may be hard for some of them to recover.
Some of those efficiencies that you're talking about in the supply chain will have to come as a result of identifying friction points in the supply chain. What are the biggest friction points in the digital advertising supply chain right now?
Well, the thing that I obsess about most is just making certain that the supply chain is as efficient as possible and that we're creating price discovery on every single impression. There are tons of efforts that sometimes advertently and sometimes inadvertently obfuscate the supply chain. That's very bad for the ends, publishers or content owners and advertisers. And because we try so hard to align our interests with advertisers, we're very interested in making certain that advertisers and agencies are not hurt by the supply chain obfuscation. And so just making certain that we get better and better at creating more transparency and rewarding transparency. This is once again an opportunity for CTV to lead the way. And I'll just go on record as saying, maybe I'm skipping ahead to the question that's going to come, what does my crystal ball say about the next year? There is going to be a massive shift in valuations of inventory on the internet, where those that are authenticated get a higher premium, and those that are not authenticated get less. And because CTV has nearly 100% authentication, we're going to see an even greater premium from that, and then more and more efforts to make certain that there's authentication on the rest of it, an authentication that isn't taxed by Apple and Google as content owners are trying to own their own fate.
I think we have a good understanding of where authentication lies right now, or the problems with it on the open web. We're talking about UID. How do we create an identifier? We know CTV does not have this problem as much, but there are some other digital mediums that I'm confused about where they stand, like gaming. Where does gaming stand on identification?
Well, so in the mobile part of gaming, you have sort of the interactions between mobile gaming companies and Apple, where there's a fair amount of friction right now that I don't believe the dust is settled yet. So TBD on that. And then on other platforms, you have a similar dynamic, which is there is a platform that is a gateway that you could argue that Microsoft in gaming on Xbox plays a similar role to what Amazon does for Amazon Fire in terms of the operating system for the TV. So it's partly determined by what they do, but in order for gaming companies to get the most out of an ad-funded option, they need some identity currency, and the dilemmas are exactly the same as what we've been talking about everywhere else.
Okay, so then my final question for you. I know we were talking about crystal ball, what's happening for the next year. What's happening for the next 10 years? What's the ad landscape going to look like a decade from now?
So I think we're not going to be talking about walled gardens much. I believe that the walls will mostly have come down. And that is really going to be because of the 1-2 punch that's happening right now, which is CTV and retail. We've talked a lot about measurement today. The role that retail plays in making it possible to measure in conjunction with CTV makes it so it doesn't make sense to be a walled garden for anybody, but especially anybody other than Facebook and Google. So those will be the last walls standing, if you will, but 10 years from now, we're not talking in terms of walled gardens versus non-walled gardens. We're talking in terms of efficacy and how do we spend as well as we possibly can. And we'll move on in the same way that the financial markets move on from talking about real-time stock buying. We'll move on from that and be talking about efficacy.
And those will be the last two standing because they're the biggest right now?
Yeah, because they're the biggest. And if walled gardens are defined as being big enough to be draconian, they're big enough to be draconian today. They can say, buy it my way. And they've also done so well with last click and last touch attribution. And I mean, Facebook has built the best on-ramps for SMBs arguably ever. So they have some amazing sort of moats around their walled garden businesses that I don't think any other walled gardens have.
Super enlightening, Jeff. Thank you so much for this. And I wanted to just, before we leave you all, kind of sort through some of the alphabet soup because we went through a lot today. So I like what you said about we've been winning an unfair marketplace. And hopefully that gets more fair depending on what happens with the Google DOJ lawsuit. You will take a leadership position in how the industry responds to it. I think Google made it a lot of, you called it a moat of complexity. I think we also touched on the fact that we all made ourselves a moat of complexity. The upfronts will go away eventually, not that they're going to be done with. And the ideal would be to increase that CPM from $10 today to $40. The forward market and spot market can operate in conjunction with each other. And for those who need just that bit of clarification, forward market is a philosophy. It's a technology that the trade desk is pioneering, and it's also a marketplace. I like what you said about in 1 year, there's just going to be a massive shift towards authentication being where the value is. And then lastly, just in 10 years, the walled gardens going away thanks to CTV and retail. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We appreciate it.